Damian Hines.
Thank you, and thank you all three for being here today. I should say I'm going to come at my questions from the perspective of a rural constituency MP, where quite often we say our priority isn't so much getting gigabit everywhere, but rather getting just a bit everywhere, particularly in those harder to reach areas. Can we start just with these figures, the 10% that became 20%, and some industry estimates, I think, put it at 25% of homes that wouldn't be commercially viable. Where do those numbers come from? How are they modelled?
Do you want me to start on that? So there was an exercise done by it's not the National Audit Office, it's the National Infrastructure Commission, sorry. The National Infrastructure Commission did an exercise a couple of years ago which looked at the costs of deploying different types of networks, whether it be full fibre, extending the existing FTTC, fibre to the cabinet network, looking at wireless and looking at cable. And that looked at the costs of doing those different networks in different places. So the costs are reasonably secure, I would say.
Isn't there one really important element of the formula missing, which is take-up? So a lot of the costs are going to be fixed costs to serve a particular area, and mathematically, whether you get a 10%, 1/3, or 3/4 take-up of eligible properties transforms the economics. So what's the assumption on take-up when you install to an area?
Again, I think that varies from operator to operator and region. So obviously, where we've got more competition in areas, then people are sort of working on anything from sort of 25 to 40%.
But in these hard to reach areas, and I speak as someone who represents one, you don't get a lot of competition.
Indeed, but again, it depends what sort of regulation is being put around it. So yes, you're right. A lot of the newer people who are building in some of these hard to reach rural areas, and they're working on a sort of 60% penetration take-up rate. Now, in time, in theory, that should go to 90, 100%. But it's unclear when, and it all depends on regulation in terms of, are they going to get overbuilt by other people? Do they become competitive? So I think it's very hard to sort of pick that number. I think everyone would love it to be high, but for it to be high, there has to be no competition.
Now, you do get this phenomenon in some rural areas where the service improves, the network gets upgraded, and nobody knows about it. And if you're lucky enough to be elected as a member of Parliament, you tend to know about it because you're the sort of person who goes on Twitter the whole time and looks up where the cabinets have been upgraded. But no actual member of the public, unless they're actively informed by somebody, gets to know about it. And the allegation is, or the suggestion, shall we say, is that there isn't a great commercial incentive sometimes for operators to tell people that they could upgrade to a better service, because the service they're currently on sometimes has a higher price attached to it because they haven't switched for a number of years. So there doesn't seem to be the incentive to tell people when it's available, which will artificially suppress take-up. How would you respond to that, Andrew?
I think all our members are working really hard to make sure that take-up is there, because everyone recognises that certainly the people building it and investing need take-up. So they are providing incentives to make that happen. That goes right across the board, whether you're OpenReach or whether you're a new entrant. You need that take-up in order to make it work. In terms of some of the larger ISPs, then they have to sort of re-engineer their systems and ordering systems, etc., to cope with these new networks and new suppliers, and that takes time. But there are people out there selling these networks and trying to make sure that everyone knows. But it is, as you allude to, there is an uphill battle in terms of convincing the consumers that actually they should move over. I think one of the sort of catch-22 is that the superfast rollout was very successful, got to 97, 96, 97%. And for a lot of people at the moment, that suits them absolutely fine. And they don't see the need or requirement to necessarily move over to gigabit-capable services as they come along. So actually convincing people to move onto these networks is a challenge, and that's where we need.
So Andrew, you mentioned these salespeople who are out and about trying to persuade people to switch over to these networks. So typically in a rural area where you don't have door-to-door marketing activity, and there aren't a whole range of different providers trying to get in on the act. What is this sales activity that's going on?
Actually, it is becoming door-to-door for a lot of those operators, along with their national marketing. But obviously, it's hard. We can often get criticised for national advertising that says switch to this wonderful new stuff, when at the moment only sort of 14% or so people can actually access it. So there's a balance to obviously be done as to quite when you push some of that marketing.
Malcolm, in terms of the new the schemes that we expect to come forward, what mix do you anticipate between block subsidy for blocks of residential properties versus voucher scheme or other types of funding?
It looks like the public funding from government through BDUK will be about 4 billion in the outside-in programme, and about 1 billion of vouchers.
And what lessons do you think there are to be learned from the rural gigabit voucher programme?
It's very flexible. A lot of people like it a lot. It enables operators to connect quite challenging areas. So, for instance, one of the discussions being had with BDUK at the moment is the extent to which vouchers might be part of the solution to being able to connect farms, for instance, or properties with long driveways or which are further away from the network than others. The vouchers can be very helpful.
Looking at the rural gigabit voucher and the community fibre partnerships, how can you speed up those processes dramatically?
I think the speeding up, in a sense, is dependent on BDUK coming to a conclusion about how it's going to organise the funding programme, the F20 or the outside-in funding programme, what the lots are going to be like. They're going to be dividing the area up into lots, and we don't yet know what those look like and how they can be bid for, as it were. That's all going to happen.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Andrew.
I was going to say the other areas, obviously, around speeding everything up, scaling generally, and not just for outside in, but everywhere, are around street works, way leaves, planning consent. These are all things where just delay the whole system in terms of operators being able to mobilise and actually do a whole area at a time. You can just get quirks, even in urban areas, not necessarily rural. You get roads which are not adopted, therefore you have to get permission from everybody. If one person objects, you can't almost do the whole street. These are all the issues which just cause delays anywhere and everywhere in the process.
That may well be, Andrew, but there are also complaints that you'll hear often from rural communities, and if you don't, I'll be happy to forward you some correspondence, that even take out the way leave issues, the street works issues, it just takes a long time sometimes to get something going through something like the community partnerships. So that was really the essence of my question. What can operators do in this new world to make that work much more efficiently and responsively?
We're scaling up. The recruitment levels are huge in terms of the skills and people bringing in. So to bring in more crews, but that requires training. Obviously, you don't want just anybody turning up, digging up your drive. They have to be sort of properly skilled, trained, etc. And that's a huge workforce that we're trying to put together. But those are happening with apprenticeship schemes, training schemes, etc. So anything that again can help with that, but I'm sure we'll come on to it, but COVID has shut down a lot of those training places. So they're also things that are causing delays.
And Andrew, also to you, how do you see competition and choice working in future in these, particularly in these rural areas where there isn't greater choice at the outset? So, you can pull your cable through an open reach duct, but thereafter, for that consumer, for that household, where is their competition and choice?
So that's happening at two levels. So there is already significant choice in terms of end ISPs who sit on a number of operators. Obviously, historically, that's all been on top of OpenReach. As we expand the number of infrastructure providers, then one of the challenges is to ensure that all that choice of ISPs is still available across those different platforms and infrastructures to hide that. So that's work that's going on within the industry anyway, often referred to as wholesale platforms. And obviously there's work going on with the European Communication Code to make switching simpler, which again will drive operators to be able to sit and operate and make available these new networks.
So just to be clear, so if you have a company that connects up your home to the network, obviously eventually using OpenReach infrastructure, but the company that has connected your home to that, thereafter, 2-3 years further on, does the consumer have a right to then move to another service provider, even though there's somebody, there's an intermediate layer of infrastructure, if you like, between the on-the-premises kit and the OpenReach infrastructure?
So we have a complete blend. So there are people who only deal with the end customer, so they are the sort of the ultimate billing, selling company, and there are those that only build infrastructure. And then obviously there's a whole bunch of people who do both. So we've got a very flexible sort of market system. And obviously depending on which one of those you are in or is available to you at your particular premise, the degree of switching and so on you've got. But generally speaking, there will be consumer choice in terms of operators. There may or may not be choice in terms of the wires that come in, depending on who's built it and how competitive your area is.
Thank you. And finally, from me, a question perhaps to all three of you. So this, the £5 billion, if it's 20% of households, you get if it's 10% of households, you get about almost £2,000 a home. If it's 20%, you get almost £1,000 a home. One or another, it's still a reasonable amount of money. And I just wonder, what are the chances that before this programme is over, some other technological solution will come along with a unit cost of less than £1,000 per household? For example, how much of this could be done by 5G? Gareth, why don't you start?
Well, I think this is the point of the nuance to gigabit connectivity. So we're not competing; we're complementary. There are opportunities for competing, and fixed wireless access, certainly in rural areas, could provide a solution. But I think you're going to need both. I mean, very much someone said, is 5G the silver bullet? I would say it's not quite the silver bullet. It certainly is one. You're still going to need fibre to fire that gun.
So, speaking from Inca's perspective, many of Inca's members, operators, build both wireless and fibre networks. Many of them started by building wireless networks first because they were cheaper to deploy, particularly in challenging rural areas. And wireless networks are improving, and 5G is potentially, with the right spectrum and the right equipment, etc., is potentially a very important element of the whole deployment going forward.
But when you say you need a blend, Gareth, so I get that, but if you can do the last 100 yards, or it's probably a bit more than 100 yards in rural areas, can that be done by 5G? And if so, presumably that gives you much rather less than £1,000 a household unit cost.
I think we're still in the very early stages of 5G. We are only we have got 60 cities and towns across the UK, and the spectrum for 700 megahertz, which will assist with the rural side of things, is yet to be auctioned off, but early next year. As I said, I mean, I think we still need fibre into the base stations to get there anyway. So going back to that point, it is part of the solution, but it's certainly not the only solution.
But so forgive me, I'm not as you can tell, I'm not a telco engineer. But I mean, presumably, what's really driving these high costs is getting the fibre to the individual, or getting the connection to the individual premises rather than the backbone of the network. I mean, I'm thinking back to Scandinavia, Sweden. When mobile phone networks were first coming out, you would see mobile phone masts in places that didn't have fixed line telephone connections because it just it just short circuits the economics. I just wonder if there's an opportunity here to do something similar for the local loop.
I think there is an element here is where we need to look also to the planning system. In Scandinavia, you have an average mast height of 90 metres to cover a much wider area. Our average mast height in the UK is 18 metres. So I think, again, we have to look at what we want and what we are prepared to do to be able to give ourselves the opportunities to that. As we've started this conversation, there are a lot of areas where we can look at to remove potential barriers to bring technologies better suitable for areas. But I think at the moment, as we say, 5G certainly is a complementary part of that, but we still need to get that fibre out into rural areas to provide that backhaul to those base stations.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm not advocating 90-metre high masts, just in case any of my constituents are watching. But just for our technical understanding, if we did have much higher masts, if we allowed much higher masts in the UK, would that transform the connectivity potential of 5G mobile networks?
Well, again, I think we're looking at the joint technologies here of 4G and 5G. It certainly is true that higher masts would help, but as we say, that's certainly not. We're not looking for 90-metre masts either. What we are looking for is flexibility in the system to provide the best solution at the right place.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
And I think if I can just add, without getting into sort of physics, but in order to do higher speeds, you'd need to use different frequencies at shorter distances. So higher masts is great for good line of sight and longer distances, but it doesn't necessarily improve your bandwidth. So for 5G to really operate at the gigabit speed, you've actually got to be a lot closer. Hence why there has to be far more masts rather than necessarily higher masts. So it's a trade-off. And I think one of the challenges there is when you're looking at three particular properties which are in a very difficult position, you almost get to the case-by-case basis rather than a simple solution, which is if only we do this, we can do everything. When you get to this final sort of 5% or even 2%, you're almost on a case-by-case basis of what's the right solution for this particular one in terms of you looking at value for money. If you're just looking for expediency to do it, it's put fibre and dig the road because you just know it's going to solve the problem. So are we after speed or are we after most cost-effective use of money? Then you potentially have to approach it in a different planning way.